Swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth. In the beginning. Well, when was the beginning? People were born, people died. Well, not in that order. They were born, lived, and died. Scratch that. They were born, cried, ate. Well, if they found any food. After eating, cried, and died. Yes, died. A lot of dying back then. From natural disasters, wild animals, and then their neighbors. They fought, killed, searched for food, hid from disasters, searched for food again, then died. Come tomorrow, wandered, went everywhere on foot. No cars, no streets, not even GPS. Then, they searched for food again, settled, tried finding food again, settled, ran from animals, died. Did we mention dying? Then suddenly, things changed and there was America. Greatest nation on earth. Maker of all things great. We even checked with history professors. All great things started in America. America. Famous for great inventions like the Ferris wheel, the Big Mac, and bigger tummies. How about policing? Not quite. The first record of something close to being a system of policing was in ancient Egypt. This is in reference to the organization of a formal police system, which is totally different from the act of policing. The actual act itself goes as far back as human society itself.
Hey Pharaoh, I know you're the son of the gods and all that cool stuff, but we need people to pay taxes and obey laws. Any ideas?
Simple. Henceforth, I declare you Seb Harry Secker.
Buddy. What's that? In English, please?
Fatty. I'm not your buddy.
I'm not fat. I'm thick bone.
Whatever. You shall be chief of the hitters. Now go collect those taxes, Fatty. Did you notice that in ancient Egypt, the word for police chief literally translates to chief of the hitters? Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Of course you are. However, I don't think we should just assume those in power in ancient times hit their subjects. So what if a large number of their workforce were slaves? Egypt's influence and customs traveled far across the ancient globe, and other societies modeled themselves after her.
Hey Alex, any ideas for another war? Been a while we killed some people, don't you think?
Of course. Egypt.
So it was. In 332 BCE, at the young age of 24, Alexander the Great rode into Egypt, and the never-before-defeated empire fell to the Greeks. With the Greeks as the new world power, they had just one thing left to do. Hey, great Alex, I doubt they realize you whipped their butts. Not sure they know their fathers are dead, their homes burned down, or smell that funky stuff from rotting bodies. Shouldn't you prove to them you're the new boss? That was the way of victories back then. Well, perhaps even now. Hence, the Greeks changed the world. They gave the world democracy, philosophy, math, medicine, the Olympic Games, theaters, and yes, a more improved form of policing.
Thought this policing thing improved from the days of ancient Egypt.
Well, not that improved, buddy. The policing in the Greek Empire still came with a ton of problems.
Better select folks that are capable of the job. Ubald, Old Main.
In Greek, the word for city is polis, and historical evidence suggests that the Greek philosophers believed policing was best done within the small city-states, rather than a national affair. Remember those improvements we talked about earlier? This was one of them. Hence the 10 city-states of Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, Syracuse, Aegina, Rhodes, Argos, Eretria, and Ilys all had their different police. Soon this phenomenon spread to the other 1,000 city-states, yet policing was still plagued with issues.
Hey, dude, can you do more on this police thing?
Oh my.
The magistrates appointed 3 different levels of police in the ancient Greek city-states. The top level handled cleanliness, the middle level handled order in the markets, and the low level, well, take a guess.
There are still issues. Fix it.
Hence the magistrates hired some slaves to help with maintaining order in public places and handling criminal justice issues that had to do with the lower class. The practice of using slaves for low-level police work endured beyond the fall of ancient Greece. And here we come to our favorite empire of old, and to the Romans. In 7 BCE, Emperor Augustus reformed the art of policing in the ancient Roman Empire. Gentlemen, the city of Rome shall henceforth have 14 wards, and each ward shall be made up of precincts. Deal? The head of the wards was called a vicomagistri. His duties included fire protection and other administrative duties in the wards. Hey, you're idle. How about the emperor gives you some more work? Their duties were soon expanded to include being night watchmen. They also had to recruit some slaves to assist in watching over the violent streets of ancient Rome. Dude, what is being an empire if you don't force everyone around you to act like you? Learn from the guys before you. Does it matter you may make some enemies? Exactly what I thought. Soon, Rome had a ton of enemies and ended up fighting a ton of wars. One set of famous enemies was the Gauls. Pay attention to these guys. They come up later by another name. By the time the ancient Roman Empire fell, those member states mostly fell apart into what became different tribes or tribe nations, as they always were before the empires forced them to live together. One of such places was a collection of islands in the west. These islands would later become one nation, and also later become an empire in their own right. Hey buddy, I know you don't realize you would be great later. In fact, so great, you would think it necessary to add great to your name. But how did it begin? Back then, their communities were divided into small groups called tithings and headed by a tithingman. They bonded on something called the Frank Pledge. Simply put, the Frank Pledge demanded that every man would be responsible for each other in that community. These tithings were further divided into 100, headed by, you guessed it, 100 men. These hundreds were further divided into shires. Shires would later become counties. Ever heard of some shires before? Bet you have. Cheshire, Hampshire, Oxfordshire, and on and on. The shires were supervised by a shire reeve. Did you catch what they did there? Today that has been merged into one word, sheriff. That was the hue and cry system. It's just a fancy term for yelling, thief, stop the thief. Once you hear that, you join everyone in the community to chase after the criminal. If one didn't join in, such a person would face a fine. But what happened if the criminal escaped, and there were no witnesses to the crime? Good question, buddy. That would be your job. If the criminal escaped and there were no witnesses to the crime, then the victim had the duty of being on the lookout for that criminal. By the way, someone remind me why it's called the good old days. Later in England, the office of constable was established from a French word. It initially only referred to someone holding a high office, and the meaning continued to evolve with time. Hey buddies, how would you like to be called constables?
Is that not something that means doing some work?
Hell no, it would mean you're my buddy.
Woo! Yeah.
Constables were only appointed by the king. It was a big deal. It showed you had connections. With time, their duties expanded from overseeing night watchmen to include the calling of time, lighting street lamps, and reporting weather conditions and fires. Imagine there was a time humans took pride in having jobs that your Alexa can do today. Good old days indeed. In 1287, this guy, King Edward I, passed what was called the Statute of Winchester. This stated, 1. It was everyone's duty to maintain peace and any citizen could arrest an offender. 2. Constables were to be assisted by their inferior officers, the watchmen. And now to be a constable was some special duty. 3. If an offender was not caught red-handed, then guys, dial 911. Oh wait, I'm sorry. I mean raise the hue and cry. Must we remind you? Everyone had to keep arms and follow the cry when required. Arms here meant sticks, knives, and stones. Europe had no guns till the 14th century. And 5. Constables were required to bring offenders to court. And that was the beginning of a huge change. With time, the elites abandoned that post for commoners. Of course, how do you expect this guy to enjoy doing that kind of work? In 1361, under King Edward III, the Justice of the Peace Act was passed into law. This further streamlined the concept of policing. It ended the mandatory involvement of neighbors in law keeping. The Justice of the Peace Act also established who could be a Justice of the Peace. It further outlined the duties of constables, who were assisted by the watchmen. Nevertheless, crime continued to be on the rise. Between the 16th and 19th century, the elites in society like the merchants and the clergies began to pay people for protection of their properties, and bam, elite private security began. With the rich paying for private security, a few things were certain. The first being that since the poor could not pay for security, they suffered the consequences of crimes way more than the rich. This stayed the same way for hundreds of years. It was not until 1829 that Sir Robert Peel, referred to as the father of modern policing, established the London Metropolitan Police Force and laid down the 9 principles of policing, which remains till today.
Hey guys, can I be a part of this thing?
Dude, we are in the middle of something here.
Where were we? Yes, the 9 principles of policing.
What about me?
Where have you been?
Cut it out. Dude, I'm not even certain if I am a nation or just a group of colonies for now.
Okay, back when it was still referred to as the United Colonies, the United States modeled after Europe with respect to most things, even policing. Hence, in the then United Colonies, the first form of policing was the night watchman. Boston created hers in 1636. New York joined the ranks in 1658. Philly was a distant third in 1700. All this time, they were fully overseen by the Office of Constables, as was seen in England. The night watchman system was equally like that of Europe's, plagued with many issues. First, they were mostly volunteers or people serving as a form of punishment. And just in case you didn't catch it, they were night watchmen, meaning they worked only at night. Yet, they often slept on duty or worse, got drunk, and then slept on duty. It took over 100 years before there was a day watchman system. Philadelphia created hers first in 1833 and New York followed in 1844. This was after the idea of a centralized municipal police department gained ground in the United States. Once again, Boston led the way, establishing the first police force in the United States in 1838, and New York was a close second in 1845. Chicago joined the ranks in 1851. In fact, by the 1880s, all major U.S. cities had municipal forces that were publicly funded with bureaucracies, had full-time employees, instead of only volunteers, and were accountable to a central government authority. By the way, why did it look like the United States seemed to overtake Europe in all these? Well, she didn't. Recall our friends, the Gauls. Remember earlier, we hinted that the concept of countries is a fairly new thing. Back then, you had tribes or tribe nations or kingdoms. The Gauls are a typical example. The Gauls had always been a warring people. They were a huge enemy of the Roman Empire. Today, a majority of what made up the former Gauls can be called the nation of France. The French have waged wars for centuries. In fact, as part of their history, they have a war called the 100 Years' War, which, as you must have guessed, lasted over 100 years. Take a moment to imagine that for a moment. People being born in a war, living in a war, becoming adults in a war, having their own children in war, and eventually dying. But the war is still ongoing. There is a phrase for that. Yes, the good old days. How could we forget?
Your Majesty, those soldiers are robbing the people once again.
What?
Yes, dude, they are. With the many wars the French fought, it was not uncommon to find soldiers rob citizens in the brief moments between wars. So basically, soldiers go out to fight for the freedom of the French people. And that freedom meant getting robbed. Though the French also had night watchmen, it was clear reforms were needed. Fast. Guess? Did you say guess? Hey buddy, let's remind you how this thing works. The people are waiting for you to do something. Buddy, we have a story to tell here. Can you act already? In 1536 and 1544, King Francis I instituted the first systematic measures to police France. The goal was simple. Look out for plundering soldiers. To do this meant moving around the countryside to see what those naughty soldiers were up to. The new military police were not allowed to stay in one place for more than 2 days in a row. And there you have the concept of police patrolling being born. The king also gave these military police power to sentence and inflict punishment on offenders. Yet, even this was not enough. What? In 1666, things got even better with policing. A more formal form of policing was instituted in France and other parts of Europe actually competent. This was necessary in France following a plague and food riots. Speak of a double whammy. The king at the time, King Louis XIV, didn't want a mob threatening his royal authority. Clever dude. He is not the longest ruling monarch in history for no reason. He could tell his people were capable of a revolution. Oops, that actually came true some 70 years after his death. And the French Revolution would later introduce some dude named Napoleon. He too, through his minister of police, the renowned Joseph Fouché, would make renowned changes to the police. This guy here is Joseph Fouché. His job is to protect this dude over here. Vive la France. I am the emperor. Yes, dude. We figured you kinda famous. Napoleon had achieved a huge deal militarily, and he was very young. In fact, he was about 28 when he got famous. Fouché had a problem on his hands because naturally, Napoleon had a lot of enemies. After a failed assassination attempt on Napoleon in 1800, Fouché turned his full attention to protecting only Napoleon. In fact, it led him to create two forms of policing. High policing, which focused on national security, and low policing, which he did not like much because, as he described it, it was the policing of prostitutes, thieves, and lampposts. The police in France were more military-like. The rulers felt that was a necessity given how difficult it was to govern France. Other nations in Europe adopted the French method while others modified it. However, bottom line is, policing across the world organically grew and improved over time following these foundations from Europe. However, on that of the French, it was a little bit different for a while. Think about it. When a people chop up the heads of their royals and about 17,000 political enemies, in just about a year's time, it's easy to assume it's a bit different around there. And did we mention the 100 Years' War? Thank you for watching. As a channel dedicated to historical stories, we're aware of historical patterns that remain prevalent today. It is shameful that in today's world, we still have hunger, abuse of women and children, oppression of the less privileged, and animal cruelty. We remain passionate in addressing these issues through our little outreach programs, where we aim to feed the hungry, support survivors of abuse, assist in the education of less privileged children, and end animal cruelty. Please kindly consider supporting us on Patreon. Your support would enable us to continue doing what we love, as well as supporting these outreach programs. There are also a ton of benefits for our patrons, including backstage access to us, video cuts, and details excluded from published YouTube videos. There are also benefits for small businesses, who can leverage a plethora of our services. Once again, thanks for watching.